Hey everyone, I wanted to take you through the lesson for today so that we're all clear on the requirements and expectations. So the topic for today's lesson is the real Black Panthers, and we're going to explore the history and legacy of the real Black Panthers. The first slide here is the unit inquiry questions and the learning target. So here I'm going to stop you. If you have not completed the Nearpod from Wednesday, I'm going to ask that you stop this Nearpod, go back and complete the Wednesday Nearpod, which explains and gives a detailed definition of contrast and contradictions along with examples, because this Nearpod is going to ask you to use those skills even further than they were used on Wednesday. So if you haven't completed the Wednesday Nearpod, please go back and do so. This Nearpod is going to compare the narratives or the stories of the Black Panther Party using contrast and contradiction. Okay, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is go to Padlet as a do now, and I put the link there. Copy and paste that and put in your browser. The password for this assignment is Panther, and you're going to either answer question 1, which asks, is being pro-black the same as anti-white? Or you're going to answer question 2, how often do you see yourself and your culture in what you learn in school? And then this is the activity for this lesson today. So for the next slide, you're going to compare using contrast and contradictions, which you learned in the Wednesday lesson. So for this activity, you're going to learn a more authentic history of the Black Panther Party by comparing how the Panthers have been portrayed in high school social studies textbooks to the information that's not in the textbooks, to information that is more primary source, meaning from the Black Panthers themselves. Notice and note the contrast and contradictions. When reading the text and the information, in one story contrasts and contradicts to the other. So you need to stop and ask yourself, what is the difference and why does it matter? At the bottom here, I included a link to a YouTube video, which is a James Brown song, and there are images that kind of follow the history of Black people in America and the oppression that they have suffered. Here is a look at the first activity slide, and that's Exhibit 1, Policing the Police. And the directions state you're going to read Story 1, which comes from a high school textbook, and then you're going to read Story 2, which is a primary source, meaning it comes from the Black Panther Party, and you're going to then compare and contrast these two. What are the contrasts and contradictions that you see happening between these two stories? You're going to keep that information, remember that information, move on to the open-ended question, where you're going to examine some additional information, okay, in the image here, and then you're going to complete the 2 steps. So step 1 asks you to think of what you read in the previous slide, look at the image on this slide, and then respond to both questions. How does the first narrative portray the Black Panther Party? And question 2, how does the second story compare and contrast to the first? The next exhibit is the Uniter. Again, you have the first story from a high school social studies textbook. Again, you have story 2, which is an excerpt from a speech by Fred Hampton. And you're going to see the contrast and contradictions between these 2 stories. You're going to take that information into the open-ended question slide. And again, you're going to think about what you read in the previous slide, examine the images on this slide, and then you're going to complete the sentence stems. So the first sentence stem says the first story about the Black Panthers shows them as, but then the second story, and you're going to complete these sentence starters. Okay. Exhibit 3, Collective Care. Again, you have a story from a high school social studies textbook. And then story 2 is from the Black Panther Party themselves. It's a primary source document. Then you're going to examine the additional information on this slide. Okay. And you're going to think about the information from the previous slide, look at these images, and then respond to the questions that we saw on the previous or the first exhibit slide. Okay. How does this narrative portray the Black Panther Party? And how does the first narrative portray the Black Panther Party, and how does the second story contrast and contradict with the first? Okay, and then here's the last exhibit, Shattered, and here you have, again, a story from a social studies or a high school textbook, and here you have an excerpt from Ward Churchill's Agents of Repression. And here, the final open-ended question, you're going to think about the previous slide and those two stories, and then you're going to complete step 1 and step 2. So you're going to answer both questions, and you're also going to complete the sentence starters. And here's some additional information on ways that the United States government has worked to suppress the Black nationalist movement in the United States. Okay. Then what I'm going to ask you to do is revisit our definition of criticality. So I gave you the definition of criticality yet again, and I also included the link to our YouTube video on what criticality is. And remember, criticality is not critical thinking. It's about reading texts and examining experiences and understanding how power and anti-oppression function within our society. And the next 3 slides are going to give you examples of criticality using the Black Panther Party, and you'll see examples of how power was used against them and how they were oppressed and suppressed. Okay? And here we have some additional information about the breakdown of the Black Panther Party and also its legacy today. I know when we think Black Panther, we think of the movie, but there's a deeper meaning here. So take a look at the information listed here. Be sure to watch the original video before you watch the trailer. And this way you can really see the influence that the Black Panther Party has still on today's society. The next video is the perspective of a Black woman, Dr. Angela Davis. She is an activist, an educator, a scholar, and an author. She was a member of the Black Panther Party, but then left because she was feeling that they had sexist practice towards the Black women within their community. And here she's going to discuss the issues that she sees when she sees journalists covering protests and revolts. And we can compare that to what we've seen over the summer and the spring and even yesterday. How does the media cover protests and revolts based on what they think their audience wants to see? You know, you talk about CNN and you talk about Fox News. Fox News is catering to a conservative audience, so they portray or they give out the information that will connect to their audience, where CNN is more of a liberal audience, so they're going to portray the information in a different way, almost the opposite that Fox News does. So that's why it's important. You can't always just rely on one media source for your information. You have to do some background information. So here you have a clip from Angela Davis discussing the media and how the media sometimes does not really show what is happening on the streets when it comes to these protests. And we're going to look further into this interview later on in the unit. And then you see a very prime example of how the past meets the present, and you can see the influence of the Black Panther Party on the 2016 halftime show that Beyonce performed, and she has a lot of influence from the Black Panther Party. And then there was a lot of backlash to her dressing and performing in such a way. And here you'll see that on this slide, right? So you'll see how many people felt as though Beyonce had overstepped her bounds because of what they had known and what they had learned of the Black Panther Party. And you're going to see a clip right here from Fox News, and that's Rudy Giuliani. And there's some additional information about the Boycott Beyonce movement. And I'll let you guys to read this information on your own. And then you need to practice what the scarecrow does in the lesson or in the do now from Wednesday's lesson, right? You always need to look deeper. It's so important to educate yourselves and, don't just take what you read in a textbook or, what you read online as fact or as the only truth, right? We've learned from the previous unit that social media will only give you what they think you want to see, and they won't present you with the whole story. So it's really important that you get out there and you educate yourself and you challenge the narratives that you understand to be true, and go out there and make sure that they are true. And here I also wanted to just mention, Black people have led the struggle for democracy and for equality, and they have fought for the rights that are listed in the Bill of Rights and the rights that the founding fathers thought all people should have. And I've said this before, you know, we haven't fulfilled the promises of our founding fathers. I think they had the right idea, but I think we messed it up. And the Black people in this country have fought and struggled for their rights, and it's something to be admired. But it's also important to remember that, you know, the history and the culture of Black people is not just struggle and resistance. There's also joy, you know. So please think back to what we looked at Black Twitter, and we looked at so much joy that is present within the Black community and Black culture that is arguably stolen by American culture. And, you know, it's important to know that even though there is struggle, there is joy.